As many of you have probably read in the newsletter or in our Stay Connected emails, we're doing something a little bit different this year during Lent. So we've departed from the lectionary, which means that we're not necessarily following the assigned readings by the church. And we've picked a topic for the next 5 Sundays: heaven and hell. And I want to begin by saying that what I will not be able to do is offer you concrete or definitive answers. But what we can do together is explore what the Bible does and does not say, and what Jesus does and does not say. And we also can hear similar and varying perspectives. And in hearing all of that, there's a lot of gift and value. And I also want to say that many of us have held our views of heaven and hell for quite a long time. They've in some ways formed us, either subconsciously or consciously. And I am not up here trying to take any of your view away from you. And you may agree with me on some Sundays, and you may never agree with me. And maybe you'll fall somewhere in between. Regardless of all that, what I pray we all receive through these discussions and this exploration and the proclamation of the redemptive love of Christ is not only a fuller view of heaven and hell, but ultimately of God and God's vision for the entire universe. So this week, I'd like to begin by exploring the concepts of heaven and hell as places to get to and places to avoid. Like, just how good do you have to be to get to heaven? Well, yesterday, the most providential thing happened. Carter and Jackson went with Don to the Holocaust Museum. And as they walked in afterwards, Don says to me, we've got a lot of questions that I think you're going to have to answer. And so then it started. Is Hitler in heaven? What about heaven? Where is it? Do humans turn into angels when they die? And then this is the best one. Mom, if you're in an airplane and you die while you're in the airplane, are you closer to heaven? Oh dear God. I mean, can I just say, oh dear God? I mean, right? This is seriously what happened in my household yesterday. So real life questions like these, or when your child is afraid of hell, or when you are, is one of the primary reasons that we need to talk about these things. Because how we talk about it and how we think about it infiltrates our lives. For example, this children's book, it's called What's Heaven? And there are parts of it that are beautiful, like the illustrations, and there are some things that I agree with. But there's this part in it that says, heaven isn't a place that you can see, she explained, it's somewhere you believe in. I imagine it's a beautiful place where you can sit on soft clouds and talk to other people who are there. At night, you can sit next to the stars, which are the brightest of anywhere in the universe. Everyone there is happy to be in such a beautiful and peaceful place. Okay. Nice vision, but this is what God's got in mind? Really? Puffy clouds? I'm just not buying it. But then it goes on to say, I believe that if you're good throughout your life, then you get to go to heaven. Some people believe in different kinds of heaven and have different names for it. And then it goes on to say, when your life is finished here on earth, God sends angels down to take you up to heaven to be with God. I have a few issues with the book, namely the being good enough throughout my life piece and the angel whisking me away to heaven. But, truth be told, both of these concepts could be supported in our reading today from Luke. Now, to be fair to this book, the author explains that some of the ideas expressed in the book came through discussions or ideas from her 5- and 6-year-old children. But the fact of the matter is that those children heard that message someplace that they had better be good so that they could go to heaven. And a bunch of other children have heard that idea too. Be good or else. Either from this book, probably not, or from church, or from other people. And probably some of those children who heard that message are those of us who are sitting here today. Because the truth is, we are all trying to make sense of what it means to live today, to die today, and to be simultaneously children of God. What we say impacts our children and how they grow up viewing God. It impacts our feelings of purpose in this life, and it impacts our understanding of our own intrinsic value. Basically, how we make sense of heaven and hell exposes what we think about God and God's relationship with us. It colors our idea of judgment, of forgiveness, of mercy, love, and grace. So deep breath. Aren't you glad you came today? Okay, so there are many things that are going on in today's parable. But we're just talking about heaven and hell. So in relation to heaven and hell, the real question is, what did Lazarus do to be good enough to go to heaven? Really? Because as far as I can tell, he doesn't do anything. There's actually a bit of scandal going on in this parable that we lose in our 21st century minds. The concept of paying attention to a beggar is completely and utterly foreign. It would have been, if you're going to pay attention to a beggar, it would have been viewed as wrong. It would have been viewed as going against God. The rich man, he was good. Good. He went to church, and he kept the commandments. And yet, despite all of his properness in life, he was somehow totally disconnected from God. In some ways, hell was already alongside of him his whole entire life. And Lazarus, he's not good. He's unclean, and he wasn't even allowed in church. And yet, he's with God in the afterlife. But wouldn't we also say that somehow God was with him in today's life too? That the reason Lazarus was granted eternal life was because God already knew him? And if that's the case, if he's already known by God, then heaven in some ways was alongside him his whole life. Now, you may or may not remember this, but in just another chapter in Luke, Jesus says to a certain ruler, he says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." So I'm thinking, if Jesus is not even good, yeah, not me. But you know what? Then what Peter says, Peter asks Jesus the exact question that underlies all of this. Then, who can be saved. The fact is, if we hang our hats on being good enough to get to heaven, or if that is the whole goal and point in life, then we're going to miss out on a whole heck of a lot that's going on right now. I really believe that in some ways God has handed over power to us, willingly, to aid in bringing about a promised new creation, heaven on earth. Which means that we should be much more concerned about today than tomorrow. Much more concerned about how we can aid those in Japan rather than is it judgment on the world. We should be much more concerned that things like the Holocaust never ever happen again than what religion somebody has to be. Clearly, the parable today can be read to support the classical visions of heaven and hell. But one of the most important things to remember, that it is a parable. This is said in a string of parables, which means this is not happening before their very eyes, nor does Jesus think it's actually going to play out in exactly this way. So, I'm wondering how far we can push a parable. Because I'd like to push this one just a little bit. A little bit beyond our kind of normal linear thinking. Because I'm not so sure that it's possible for us to know if we're ever good enough. If we're good or bad or in or out or righteous or unrighteous. Lazarus and the rich man and Peter, they all don't know. It's all up to God. But I would say one thing for certain. As far as God is concerned, and as far as the entire biblical witness is concerned, that in Jesus, we are all good enough, in enough, and righteous enough. So here's the thing in this parable, if we push it just a bit. We are in some ways all Lazarus, beggars, and we're poor, and we're completely dependent upon God saving us. Today, and tomorrow, and for heaven, however that happens to look. But we're also all the rich man, content with our lifestyle, indulgent, wanting to move up, wanting a better job to make more money, not wanting to get our hands dirty. We all do bad things. We're all out enough and unrighteous enough. Which means if we're both Lazarus and the rich man, right, that would mean that in some ways, heaven and hell are both alongside us every day. And I think probably most of us can agree a little bit with that on some level. Because I honestly believe with all my heart that heaven on earth today and heaven in the afterlife exist. And I freely admit that I'm not so sure where I stand on the classical view of hell. But I do know that for many of us, hell exists already on some level. But I want you to hear that it's not about you being good enough to get someplace. God's way more creative than that. I mean, look around. Maybe the looking around piece is the rich man's biggest stumbling block. Because he never opened his eyes or his heart enough to see that heaven was right there. Right in front of him. So maybe it's not about getting somewhere, but maybe it's about being somewhere. Because you have been given a life to live for God. And when we strive for that, when we know heaven, we might get there a little bit sooner than we thought. Like today. And how cool would that be?